Did you ever look at a chord chart and wonder, is there a specific emotion that I could associate to each of these chords? Many musicians, if not most of them, would answer a flat out no to this question. I'm going to argue that there are musical stereotypes and that they have come to be associated with certain chords and certain degrees of the scale over many centuries of musical practice. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything I know about those characteristics. This is knowledge that I've gleaned around over 20 years of playing the piano and 10 years of composing music, and I've never really heard anyone lay out these structures like this, so I hope it can be useful for aspiring composers or just musicians. There will be musical examples throughout this video, so you can hear if what I'm saying makes any sense or not. First of all, let me just say that I'm going to be talking here about Western tonal harmony. I'm not pretending that these are universal laws that would apply across time and space, even if there is an acoustic basis for some of these characteristics. It's not science yet. It's more like a cultural heritage. It could become a science if we had Neuralink type of stuff that could see exactly in real time what chord produces what emotion, and I think we'll get there eventually, and musicology will become a real science. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend any musicologists. Even if they are relative across cultures, though, it doesn't mean that they don't apply right now in the tonal system in which we're literally swimming all the time. So let's start from the beginning. For the musicians out there, I might be covering some stuff that you already know in the beginning of this video, but I think it's important to start from first principles, and it might give you a fresh perspective on stuff that you already are familiar with. Of course, a single note taken on its own doesn't carry any meaning. That's the reason why it's kind of annoying when, non-musicians come up to you and they want to make conversation and stuff, and they're like, music is a language, right? I mean, yes and no. Sure, it can convey some archetypal emotions and stuff that many people in the world would connect to without speaking the same language, but at the end of the day, an F sharp is an F sharp, and there's no clear dictionary of here is a word and here is the meaning of that word. Nevertheless, as soon as you start stacking notes in a chord, some relationship is starting to appear between the notes, and emotional shading is starting to appear. This is the source of the typical major-minor duality. Even though much of it is probably a social construct, and I have no problem admitting that, there is still an acoustic basis behind that. As most of you guys probably know, when you hit a note on the piano, let's say a low C on the piano, you don't only get that frequency, you also get a bunch of harmonics. And amongst the first harmonics that you do get, there is a G and there is a E, a natural E. So this is why the major chord seems to agree with itself much more than the minor chord, because there's no E flat to be found in the harmonics of C. As much as everyone seems to be agreeing on that, still individual chords don't carry a lot of meaning. In the same way that individual notes need to be put together in some form of relationship for meaning to appear, individual chords need to be put in relationship with something bigger, and that is the key or tonality. So a key is a pool of notes with a specific note acting as the center of mass, the tonic. If you put the notes in order, you get a scale. If you stack the notes up using thirds, you get a very ugly chord. But if you do a little bit of both, you get the degrees of the scale. So let's start by checking which of these chords are major, which of these chords are minor, to get a sense of the emotional shadings at our disposal. Turns out 1, 4, and 5 are major, 2, 3, and 6 are minor. It also turns out that when you stack thirds on top of a B, you get a diminished chord, which sounds even more tormented than the minor chord. Again, this has to do with harmonics. The B pretty much contains an F sharp in its own sound, and this F sharp doesn't get along very well with the F natural that it's forced to live with in the diminished chord. So we have 3 major chords, 3 minor chords, 1 diminished chord. Sounds arbitrary, right? In order to make sense of that, now is a good time to introduce some traditional concepts of functional harmony that maybe some of you have heard before, but maybe you don't exactly understand what they mean. So functional harmony divides the degrees of the scale into 3 groups: the tonic group, the predominant group, and the dominant group. The tonic is by essence the first degree of the scale. You can consider the tonic to be kind of a heavy object around which all the other notes are gravitating. So because the notes are pulled in by the gravity of the tonic, most melodies will tend to rest and finish on one of the notes of this chord. When you give this harmony to your listener in a piece, you basically make them relax, or they will think it's cheesy because they'll be like, hey, it doesn't make sense to relax here. Your music was full of drama a second ago, There were like armies chasing me, and now you're expecting me to relax here? Dude. And then they will cringe and hate your music. But still, the symbolic nature of the first degree is peace. For me, it's the musical equivalent of homeostasis. It's like all your needs are met, nothing is trying to kill you, you're in harmony with the world. If the tonic chord represents peace, the dominant represents some kind of joyful expectation of that peace. The dominant chord often comes right before the tonic and contains some happy tension that will seek its resolution towards the tonic. It's called dominant not because it's better than the others, but because it contains a strong direction. It's pointing strongly towards the first degree. Now for the predominant, the fourth degree. I really wish that music theory would have come up with a better name for this, because predominant doesn't really give us any information about the nature of that chord, except that it comes before the dominant. And I admit that it's hard to get to the heart of this harmony and talk about it in any meaningful way, but let me try. So the fourth degree is really special in music. It has a function that no other chords can replace. The fourth degree is generally where you're going to get the chills in a piece of music. It's maybe the most emotionally deep chord of the scale. There's something in it that is different from one. You can feel that it's opening new doors. It's not in the same dimension as one, so there can be some newness and freshness to it, but always in a heartwarming way. There's something extremely comforting about this chord, like receiving a big hug. Part of the reasons why this chord has such a specific effect has to do with harmonics again. Without getting into too much detail here, all the notes of the major scale can be found in the harmonics of the tonic. So again, if I play a low C on the keyboard, very quickly I'm going to find G in the harmonic series, I'm going to find E, I'm going to find D and B at some point, but I'm not going to find any F. In fact, I'm going to find F sharp before I find F. By the way, this also has to do with why jazz musicians consider the fourth to be an avoid note. It's because the F doesn't really blend well with the harmonics of the C fundamental. But in fact, you don't need to look that far to find the F. It's just that you need to look the other way. So in the same way that G is the fifth of C, C itself is the fifth of F. So this is why you can get a feeling of newness and freshness when you hear the F chord. It's because it doesn't appear in the natural harmonics of C, but you also get a feeling of returning home because you're going back to something older and bigger than you, which is the fifth below. Anyways, that was a little deep, but this degree is deep. So in the traditional scheme of things, you get this exploration slash heartwarming deepness, which then leads to the dominant, which is joyful expectation, which leads back to the tonic, which is peace. Now, if you're thinking that's a very optimistic vision of the world, you're totally right, because we haven't included the minor chords yet. Here I need to bring in another concept, which is the minor relative. I'm not going to go into too much detail on minor relatives, but let me just say that it's the minor chord that is resting 3 half steps below any major chord. It shares 2 notes in common with the major chord, and it pretty much acts as its sad counterpart. Each of the 3 major chords that we've talked about already, they each have their own sad counterpart, which feel different, but sort of play the same function in the grand scheme of things, but on the dark side of the force. So now the tonic group will include 1, but also 6, its minor relative. The predominant group will be 4 and 2, and the dominant group will be 5 and 3. So we're just going to rearrange the degrees here a little bit, because there's a symmetry that I want you to see. The pattern of tonic, predominant, dominant really has its equivalent on the minor side. You can think of these chords as 6, 2, and 3, but you can also think about them as the minor version of 1, 4, and 5. So what this means for us is the first thing that you should try to do if you're trying to manipulate the emotional content of a passage is try its minor relative, or try its relative in general. It's the first lever that you should try to pull. So let's say you have an F chord in a piece of music and you feel that it's too cheesy. The first thing you should try to do is maybe change it up for a D minor chord, or even just add a D somewhere in the harmony, and it's just going to shade a little bit the optimistic quality of the F chord. There is such a strong symmetry between the 2 structures that very often composers are going to take the 3rd degree, which is normally minor, and they're going to make it major in order to match the dominant quality of the G chord. This is where the minor harmonic scale comes from. Let me now switch gears a little bit and tell you a different story that's going to allow me to go even deeper into the emotional archetypes of each of these degrees. So up to now, we have jumped around in the scale using seconds, which has allowed us to build the scale, and then we jumped around using thirds, which has allowed us to build the degrees. Now we're going to jump around in fifths. This will give us the infamous cycle of fifths, which is probably the single compositional device that has been most used by composers, even spanning jazz and pop music. And part of the reasons why this cycle of fifths has been so popular is because it gives us a complete panorama of the emotional landscape. It takes the 7 degrees and it spins a universal story out of them. Now, normally the cycle goes quite fast in a piece of music, so let's linger on each of these chords and explore their symbolic meaning. Again, the first degree would be where we start and end. It's like the exposition in a narrative arc. If we go down a fifth, we hit F, this heartwarming chord that we talked about. It's like our little character is setting out to explore some of the world. If we go down another fifth, yikes, we hit B. We haven't really talked about the 7th degree yet because the fact that it's diminished really sets it apart from the other ones. The 7th degree is where drama strikes. It's the unpredictable event that shakes the natural course of things. It's often used by composers as a transition chord because you can easily use it to transition from the major world to the minor world. The funny thing is you could actually resolve directly this degree back to 1. But that would be like setting up an amazing storyline with conflicts and stuff and just jumping to the happy ending. Instead, we're going to follow the winding roads of the fifths, and they're going to lead us to 3. The 3rd degree is a fascinating one because it kind of has 2 faces. When it's minor, as it naturally is in the scale, it's the saddest of chords. It can be a symbol of loneliness, exile, desperation, but like I said earlier, it's often made major artificially. And in that form, it kind of catches fire and becomes a symbol of anger, intensity. Think like dancing flamenco in the afternoon sun or something like that. Once the intensity of that anger dissipates and we go down another fifth, we're going to hit the 6th degree, which is, like I said earlier, basically a sad version of 1. It has the stability of 1. Like you could end the song there, but you would end it on the dark side. So the 6th degree can be a good symbol of sadness, like some good old sadness, you know, that you can still live your life and operate and do things, but you're sad. If we go down another fifth, we find the 2nd degree. So the 2nd degree is really interesting because it's kind of unpredictable. It also has a certain gravity to its sound. So notice that when we organize the chords along the cycle of fifths, we get the 3 minor chords one after the other, and then we also get the 3 major chords one after the other. In that perspective, 2 is the last minor chord before we go back to the happy side. So this is purely personal, but for me it kind of evokes some kind of resignation, acceptance. It has a lightness to it that the other minor chords don't have. But again, it's a very slippery chord because it can lead us into the major world with a 2-5-1, but it can also go back to the minor side using a 2, 3, and 6. You should also note that this is a chord that you often find in its major form as well, as the dominant of the dominant. In this case, as a 5 of 5, it always brings some excitement to the music. That is much more obvious. Then we hit 5, which is pure joy and optimism. And sometimes this joy is a little bit too much, so we're going to add a 7th on top of it to add some tension there and bend its head a little bit, or even a 13th to add a touch of nostalgia in the G chord and bring it a little bit closer to its relative E minor. And then you come back to 1, of course. So obviously this whole symbolic universe is not a prescription of do this and you'll get that. Like if you're trying to follow rules, music is never going to work for you. Interesting music always plays with those rules. And it's not even descriptive because you can always find an instance of a 3rd degree expressing joy because there's so many other parameters to music like tempo, rhythm, etc., instrumentation. It's more a question of probabilities. It's like if you hear 3rd degree, it has more chances to be associated with sharp pain and loneliness rather than pure bliss. And you can see that very often in the lyrics that songwriters choose to put over these specific chords. So I hope this will be the beginning of an investigation on your side and not the end of it. And please find examples that contradict everything I've just said. Peace, and go make music.